Psychology is deeply unholistic, reductionistic, and dysfunctional in its current state because it ignores spirituality and non-duality. It also ignores philosophy. It ignores the importance of metaphysical and epistemic and existential considerations when treating patients. That's why therapists, doing talk therapy, psychoanalysis, this sort of stuff, they tend to have very poor results with curing patients. And the reason that is because their patients usually have a deeper problem at the spiritual, existential level, at the epistemic, metaphysical level. And most psychologists are not trained for that stuff. In fact, they might consider those things to be nonsense and not genuine science, not real medicine. And so as a result, the therapist, the psychiatrist, the psychologist, he ends up having an understanding of human psychology and human behavior at a very surface level, because you cannot understand human behavior without deep spiritual work yourself personally, because all human behavior stems from ego, and ego is not just a psychological thing, it's a deeply existential metaphysical thing. So you can't cure someone with a serious psychological issue unless you're able to understand human psychology to its bone. And you can't understand human psychology to its bone unless you understand the ego. And you can't understand the ego unless you do spiritual work. So if you're a psychologist or a therapist or a psychiatrist who's not doing spiritual work, you're basically a hack. You're negligent at your work. And your patients suffer for it. Some of them kill themselves because you weren't able to help them. See? And of course, you yourself are psychologically sick, because you can't be psychologically healthy without understanding those things. So, and university doesn't teach these things. University only teaches a very narrow version of psychology that ignores all these other factors. In fact, speaking of psychology, about 70 years ago, there was a famous psychologist whose name was Skinner. He developed the Skinner box. Maybe you heard of him. And his whole attitude and worldview towards psychology was called behaviorism. His idea was that the internal moods and feelings and attitudes and beliefs of living beings, humans and animals, didn't matter at all. We can just treat the animal or the human as a black box. There's some inputs and there's some outputs. The inputs are the stimuli, like you shock an animal with a cattle prod, electrocute the animal, and then there's some sort of response. The animal screams, the animal runs away, the animal opens its eyes, sticks its tongue out, whatever. And so he said his whole approach to science and psychology was that we don't care about anything that's going on the inside. We don't care about consciousness, none of that stuff. We don't care about how it feels. All we care about is inputs and outputs. And all that science and psychology is, as a field, is the measuring of inputs and outputs, such that, like, you can give a piece of cheese to a rat, that's the input, and then the rat, eats it, and then it jumps up and down, and that's the output. And that's literally all that reality is. That's all that science is. By today, of course, the absurdity of this gross reductionism is very obvious even to many scientists and psychologists and academics. But even though the absurdity of that reductionism is so obvious, it's so limited, it's so extremely limited, this sort of reductionism is still happening all throughout academia and all throughout science in more subtle ways.